Hello, and thank you for coming to the opening of On Naji Alali. I'm Haseeb. I curated this show, so today we're having a panel discussion, one state. So it's on the topic of the one-state solution. Naji Alali, the show is based on the work of Naji Alali, and he's one of the most well-known artists in the Arab world. He was exiled in 1948 from his home in northern Palestine, along with thousands of other Palestinians. But he later became the voice for that population by publishing in a lot of daily cartoons, daily newspapers, specifically Al-Qabas and Al-Safir. So this exhibition actually roughly commemorates the 20th anniversary of his assassination. He was killed in 1987 in London. So 2008 also commemorates the 60th anniversary of the independence of the State of Israel, and also the 60th anniversary of Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. So also featured in the show today, we have the work of Tariq al-Hussein, who did these beautiful photographs here, and also Emily Jasir. So Emily Jasir is an American citizen who can travel freely throughout Israel and the Palestinian territories, whereas Tariq al-Hussein, who's of Palestinian origin, can't enter the occupied territories or Israel. But both artists relay their distinct experiences of Palestine through their work. So here today, I'd like to ask, are Naji Alali's cartoons originally created for daily publication in newspapers still relevant today, 20 years later? And if so, why? Do they remain relevant? So in collaboration with Platypus, we've organized a series of events which take up some of these issues in depth. Platypus is a Chicago-based educational project that began in December 2006. It is focused on investigating the possibilities of an emancipatory politics today by studying the historical problems and tasks inherited by the old, new left. Platypus organizes reading groups, monthly fora, and a newspaper entitled the Platypus Review, which you can pick up here as well. So today we have Raja Halwani and Richard Rubin here to discuss the antagonism of idealism and realism underlying the discourse of the one-state solution. Raja is a professor of philosophy at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and co-author of the new book, Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, Philosophical Essays on Self-Determination, Terrorism, and the One-State Solution, which you'll find over here in the book section. And also Richard Rubin, who's a founding member of Platypus. Without further ado, I think we'll begin with presentations from our panelists. First, we'll start with Raja.
Thank you, Haseeb. Can everybody hear me? Thank you, Haseeb, for inviting me to do this. I have 15 minutes to give a presentation. I'm not going to be discussing Naji Alali, and I'm also I'm a little bit sick. So if I sneeze and cough, it's not going to be a pleasant sight, but please bear with me. So in this brief talk, I plan to address one common objection against the one-state solution, which is that it is unrealistic, or which I take to be the same thing, idealistic, and perhaps even morally dangerous. There are some morally unacceptable forms of the one-state solution, and they basically all boil down to a state in which only one group controls the land and the resources, and in which members of the other group are either expelled or ruled over by members of the other group. However, the morally acceptable form of the one-state solution is, in essence, the idea that a single state should be established for both Israelis and Palestinians in historic Palestine, which is today's Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Israel. There are two main variations of this state. The first is a binational state, with the state being for two national peoples, Israeli Jews and Palestinians, and the second is a secular state, with the state being for all its citizens, regardless of their ethnicities, religions, or original nationalities. Of course, cutting across these two forms are different possible ways that the state could actually be governed, such as a parliamentary democracy, as Israel is now, and, say, a direct election type democracy in which the people directly elect the prime minister or the president. In the book I just published with Tom Capitan, I come out in favor of the secular version of the one-state solution, the one I have in mind throughout this presentation. There are two main types of argument in favor of the one-state solution. The first is indirect and argues for it on the basis of the impossibility of the two-state solution. The idea is that because the two-state solution is now virtually impossible, we have no option but to accept the one-state solution. The other type of argument is direct and argues for the one-state solution on moral grounds. Both arguments have their merits, as I will soon illustrate, especially in terms of responding to the charge that the one-state solution is unrealistic, a charge to which I now turn. The main reason usually given why the one-state solution is unrealistic is because there is no international acceptance of or consensus on it. Here, what goes under international consensus includes not only the relevant parties, such as the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, but also the United Nations, the European Union, and the Arab world. It is worth mentioning briefly in what sense and why these parties accept the two-state solution as the answer to the conflict, because this will shed some interesting light on the whole issue of the solution's realism, or lack of realism. I think it is safe to say that most of the above bodies, especially the United Nations, the European Union, and the Arab world, have come to accept the two-state solution not only because of its intrinsic merits, but because they have perceived that no other solution is really on the table. That's my student. It is noteworthy, for example, that since the 1947 United Nations resolution to partition Palestine, there has not been a single UN resolution calling for a two-state solution along the lines advocated today. Famous resolutions, such as United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, do not call for a two-state solution, but for Israel's withdrawal from territories acquired by war. Indeed, the United Nations has almost annually renewed its General Assembly Resolution 194, which calls on Israel to allow the Palestinian refugees to return if they so choose. The fact that this resolution has been affirmed over and over does not actually sit well with the two-state solution, for its acceptance entails the possibility that thousands of Palestinians will return to Israel, a fact that might endanger its status as a Jewish state, thus defeating the very idea of the currently proposed two-state solution. Moreover, the European Union and the United States accept a two-state solution because they have generally supported Israel in what it desires and because they have come to believe that this is really the only viable solution. As to the Arab world, it too has accepted a two-state solution for similar reasons. With Israel and the Palestinians, however, things are slightly different. The Palestinian leadership has historically agitated for a single state. Up until 1988, when the Palestine National Council officially accepted negotiations with Israel on the basis of a two-state solution, the official stance of the Palestinian leadership was a single secular state for both Jews and Palestinians. The main reason, it seems to me, why the Palestinian leadership backtracked and accepted a two-state solution was its conviction that Israel was a powerful state that will never concede to such a scheme, and that it would have to be either perpetual conflict or a two-state solution. So the Palestinian leadership accepted this solution not because it saw any intrinsic merits to it, but because of realpolitik considerations. Moreover, it seems to me that this is the main reason also why the Palestinians as a people generally accept the two-state solution. Unlike many others, I do not think that the Palestinians' sense of nationalism pushes them in the direction of accepting two states, that is, having their own state. Rather, it generates in them euphoric tendencies for all Palestine. But they accept a two-state solution because, as I said, of political considerations. That is, their conviction that a single state is not about to happen and their additional fears about what might happen to them were they to live with Israelis who have wielded power over them since virtually the inception of this conflict push them into accepting a two-state solution. However, things are more complicated with the Palestinians because many of them agitate for the implementation of the right of return, knowing full well that this would be a return for their village sites inside Israel. So what the overall Palestinian reaction to a single state is not that clear. It is different on the Israeli side. There, the main reason for rejecting a one-state solution is the strength of the belief in Zionism. To the vast majority of Israelis, it is not even a question that Israel is the Jewish state. Of course it is, and any other suggestion is beyond the pale. As the conflict raged on, an additional reason for Israelis' rejection of the one-state solution emerged, namely their fears about Palestinians' hostility towards them. It is now a common theme among many Israelis that Palestinians simply hate them and have no desires for peace, especially after the Camp David fiasco of 2000 and the settler pullout of 2005 that convinced many Israelis that even though they give and give, the Palestinians still dispatch suicide bombers and fire Qassam rockets into southern Israel. But whatever the reasons, the above sketch shows that there is clearly a sense in which the one-state solution is unrealistic, especially when it comes to the parties most concerned. If both Israelis and Palestinians do not want it, how can anyone seriously propose it? Moreover, if we persist in this way, we will be treading morally dangerous terrain. At worst, we would have to impose the solution, a move that will be morally disastrous as it will no doubt lead to war. At best, given its unrealism, proposing it sends alarm signals to the people who are against it and instills false hope in those who are for it, neither of which seems to be a good idea. So what could a proponent of the one-state solution say in response to such worries? I will set aside momentarily the purported moral dangers of the one-state idea. Moreover, I do not deny for a minute the hostility with which the one-state solution is met, with which it is met. But my two main replies are the following. First, it is not that an acceptable two-state solution is that realistic. Second, I have worries about issues of realism or practicality when faced with powerful moral considerations. Let me begin with the first. I will not belabor any of the facts that we currently find in the region that seem to make a proper two-state solution viable. But let me quote from Joel Kovel's recent book, in which he puts these facts in dramatic, albeit truthful way. Commenting on the possibility of a Palestinian state, he writes, quote, "More than half a century of chewing and gnawing away at Palestinian land has left the latter more a rag doll on a stick than the framework for a living social organism. Down to some 8% of the original territory, surrounded by the IDF, laced with the Israeli Defense Forces, laced with Jews-only roads and peppered with hundreds of settlements that arrogate the water and best land, a dumping ground for Israeli waste, its fields and olive trees destroyed, its land carved up by the apartheid wall, the potential Palestinian state is no more than a bad joke," end of quote. Writing in 2002, Will Yeomans states, quote, "The fundamental problem is that a real state requires a few elements: territoriality, a monopoly on the use of force, and internal and border control. Israel will never grant a Palestinian government any of the latter, because Israel will reserve for itself the power and right to intervene in Palestine whenever it chooses," end of quote. Given this picture, I see absolutely no hope, given the current political situation, for a viable two-state solution. What I do see possible is a truncated, shrunken, weak, and barely functioning Palestinian state emerging sometime in the future. This will happen because currently the Palestinians have absolutely no bargaining power whatsoever to be able to make any demands on Israel, because no powerful political entity is about to side with them on their demands anytime soon, and because their leaders are desperate to deliver something that can be called a state. Neither the United States, nor the United Nations, nor the European Union, nor the Arab League has shown any desire, will, or ability to force Israel's hands to make concessions that would allow a viable Palestinian state to emerge. The practicality or realism of such a state emerging anytime soon has almost as much chance of success as a one-state solution. Unless drastic changes happen in the political world, a truly viable and functioning Palestinian state is not forthcoming. But if we accept this conclusion, we might as well accept the same one for the one-state solution, namely that unless drastic changes happen in the political world, no single state is about to emerge anytime soon. So my point is that both solutions basically are quite unpractical and unrealistic at this point. I keep mentioning a viable state. Of course, I have to, because this is the essence of the two-state solution. Yet if viability is the issue, then the two-state solution is, as I argued, almost as unrealistic as the one-state one. If a non-viable Palestinian state were brought into existence, then the Palestinians, who have yet to be cowed into submission, will surely rise up again. And then I can almost see Israel's reaction, backed by choruses in the United States. We gave them a state, and this is what they wanted. But look, they are rebelling again. Now we really have no choice but to crush them. It will be another version, albeit a much bloodier one, of Camp David 2000. In short, if by unrealistic we mean that there are no current real political avenues for the one-state solution, then much the same can be said about the two-state solution, as long as we have in mind a viable Palestinian state, which is the very point of the two-state solution. It is also here that I think that the indirect argument for the one-state solution is especially potent, because it points to the same type of unrealism haunting the two-state solution that haunts the one-state solution. However, if by unrealistic we mean that there is no acceptance of the one-state solution among the Israeli public, and as I hinted, its acceptance among the Palestinians is a much more complicated issue, given that most are committed Zionists, among the Israelis that is, then we have a whole different terrain to tread. The question is this: should we not pursue the one-state solution in the face of the Israeli public's desire to not have a single state with the Palestinians? It seems to me that the answer to this question hinges on two issues. First, whether or not the Palestinians have a claim to the land that is now Israel. Second, whether if there is such a claim, we should back away from it in the face of the Israeli public's desire. I answer the first question affirmatively. The refugees have a right to return, and the Palestinians in general have rights of self-determination over historic Palestine. These rights, of course, do not imply that Israelis have no rights over the same land. They do. So we come to the second question. Should these rights be relinquished in the face of Israelis' rejection of a one-state solution? I see no reason to accept an affirmative answer to this question, for much the same reason why African Americans should not have relinquished their claims to civil rights in the face of white rejection, or South Africans, black South Africans that is, relinquishing their rights in the face of Afrikaner rejection, namely that people's desires can run the gamut from the morally unacceptable to the acceptable, and that when faced with the former, moral courses of actions should not be halted because of them. So I'm not making an analogy between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the one hand and South Africa or the American civil rights movement on the other. Rather, my point is that if our reasons for seeking a single state are proper and moral, that some people are against it is not a good reason for us to back away from it. In short, that the one-state solution is unrealistic in this sense gives us no reason not to pursue it, so I do not even see it as a serious objection to it at all. I will end with a few words about moral considerations on implementing the one-state solution. Given its general rejection and the fear and the hostility that have been increasing as the conflict continues, it would be beyond stupid, irresponsible, and immoral to impose this solution on the concerned parties, although I can't see who would be doing this imposition anytime soon. This would be a recipe for bloodshed. Rather, all and only morally acceptable means should be undertaken to allow the parties involved to come to accept it, even if begrudgingly, as the only proper answer to the conflict. Given that we can never be certain whether this will ever actually happen, in pursuing the one-state solution, we would be instilling fear and anger in those who do not desire it and hope in those who do. If the solution never comes about, the hope would be false. Should we risk instilling these emotions? I see no way out of doing so. Anytime we propose moral solutions, there are bound to be parties who will not like them, and they will react emotionally in a negative way. Yet this is rarely a sufficient reason for us to backtrack. As to instilling false hope, we will never know whether the hope is instilled is false until we see the final results. And so this, too, should not be an issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Raja. First, I'd like to say also, before we begin Richard's presentation, is that there are note cards and pens being passed around the audience. So if you have any questions for the question and answer session at the end of our presentations, could you please write your question on that paper, then pass it to your left, all the way to your left, and somebody will pick it up and we'll present those. Thanks.
Okay, I also want to thank Haseeb, and like Raja, I will not be talking about Naji al-Ali, and I also, like Raja, I'm somewhat sick and have a cold, so I will also apologize for sneezing and coughing. I have some stuff written that was written at the last minute, and it's probably too long for me to speak everything, so I will probably start reading and then start ad-libbing at a certain point. I was asked by Haseeb to participate in a conversation with Raja about the one-state solution. I will not, however, either advocate for or against the one-state solution per se. Rather, I will confine myself mostly to asking what are the meanings of terms like one-state solution and two-state solution. And instead of offering solutions, I will prefer rather to interrogate the questions that such solutions purport to answer. Solutions, it turns out, are not independent of the problems one sets out to solve, and different solutions to a problem are in fact often different ways of understanding the problem itself. So the choice of a new solution is often the choice of a new way of seeing the problem. And these different ways of understanding a problem may be incommensurable. An example of this in mathematics, for example, where problems and solutions would seem to have an objective character, is that, for example, an algebraic problem, the answer to an algebraic problem solution may depend upon whether only real roots are admitted as solutions or whether complex and imaginary ones are as well. But this answer, while posed within a purely mathematical realm, actually depends upon a social realm of what mathematicians understand as mathematics. So that, for example, in the 18th century, a formula like Euler's famous e to the pi I equals -1 could be formulated, but to the ancient Greeks, to someone like Archimedes, that would have struck him as gibberish. And that's not just because knowledge advanced, but because within that mathematics, there's actually a different understanding of what mathematics and number are. So while the question posed as one versus two-state solution might seem straightforwardly to be a question of political arithmetic, i.e., how many states should one have, as the phrase goes, between the river and the sea, the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. So since last summer's takeover of Gaza, one hears joking references to a three-state solution. But in fact, the question of the number of states has almost nothing to do with the significance of the question. For example, both right-wing Jewish settlers and Hamas call for a one-state solution, although these are obviously not what people mean when they call for a one-state solution. What these people like Raja, mean by a one-state solution, at least rhetorically, whether this is the reality of what's conceived or not, is a state where Arabs and Jews have equal rights. Two somewhat different formulations are used to describe such a state. One is a secular democratic state, and the other is a binational state. In general, in the 60s and 70s, the former designation was used, and now the latter, the binational state, is used. I would actually somewhat have to disagree with Raja's description of the distinction, because historically the reason for the choice of secular democratic state actually was that the people who formulated the PLO denied that Israeli Jews constituted a nationality, that they understood Israeli Jews to be purely a religious group. And in that respect, contrary apparently to what Raja believes, I prefer the formulation binational, which I don't think is opposed to secular. Any such democratic state should necessarily be secular, because it recognizes the dual national character of the two peoples, not just the religious character of Jews. But there is, in fact, right now, and has been for 40 years, one state between the river and the sea. It's called Israel. Although the nature of the state's control in, say, Tel Aviv and Gaza is radically different in political character, and although for tactical reasons the Israeli state may allow parts of this region either official or unofficial autonomy, so Gaza, there's this withdrawal from Gaza, and Gaza was taken over by Hamas, not exactly Israel's plan, and then there are these complicated arrangements under Oslo. But clearly, what is left is not a state. The PA is not a state, and whenever Israel chooses, it can interfere in any of the parts of this territory. Israel also contains a chunk of Syrian territory, which the Palestinians don't claim, and is not considered part of historic Palestine. So leaving aside the right-wing staters, both Jewish and Arab, who are, of course, vastly more numerous and politically significant than the left-wing one-staters, there are essentially two approaches to this conflict on what might broadly be called the left. Instead of one and two state, it might be more adequate to refer to them as partitionist and anti-partitionist. Another description of the latter, the anti-partitionists, might be transformationist. The partitionists, i.e. two-staters, take for granted the antagonism between Arab and Jewish nationalism and seek to resolve it by partitioning the country between two ethnic states. Partitionists include people with a broad range of attitudes towards Zionism. Some are Zionists, but others are anti-Zionists. Although partitionists, particularly those sympathetic to Zionism, tend to describe partition as equitable, in reality, partitionism represents the negotiated surrender of the Palestinians to Zionism. Furthermore, the terms of partition on offer for the Palestinians have steadily worsened since the 1930s and 40s. By contrast, the anti-partitionist or transformationist views are ipso facto anti-Zionist and view Zionism as the source of the problem that needs to be overcome. This latter point is sometimes muddled because people who are for a one-state solution will sometimes bring up the fact that certain Zionists in the 1940s advocated a one-state solution, people like Brit Shalom and Hashemer Hatzair. I can't get right now into the question of why I think that is misleading, but we can talk about that in question and answer period. So I think that the lack of fruitful dialogue between these two views is often based on the difference in the problem that they're actually setting out to solve. The partitionist approach, if the partitionist approach is one of a negotiated surrender for the Palestinians, then the anti-partitionist approach is essentially the opposite. It, in effect, asks Israeli Jews to give up their state. But why would the victors do that? This is, in fact, the central problem, not the question of international recognition that Raja alludes to, and that with the one-state approach. For decades, the Arabs, the Palestinians first of all, and then for a while with the assistance of other Arab states, sought to destroy the state of Israel by military means, or prevent the implantation of Zionist settlers and all of these things. Having failed spectacularly to do so, the Anti-partitionists then suggest that they can accomplish by non-military means essentially the same goal. But what is the persuasive argument to convince Israeli Jews that although militarily victorious, they should abandon the cause they fought for? The arguments for the partitionist perspective are straightforward and rest on common sense observations about the presumed relationship between ethnicity and politics. Arabs are assumed to be Arab nationalists and Jews Jewish nationalists. This doesn't mean people approve of that. They just assume that's the way it is and you can't really do anything about that. For Palestinians who advocate it, it's simply the recognition of a bitter truth that they have been, as previously noted, militarily defeated, and it is the only option available. Their attitude is similar to, for example, Mexicans, who almost all Mexicans consider the Mexican-American War a profound injustice. But not even the most foolhardy Mexican nationalist, or hardly any, would attempt to overturn the Treaty of 1848 for obvious reasons, namely overwhelming U.S. military, economic power, etc. Similarly, many Palestinians say Palestinians must accept the much harsher verdict of 1948, just as Mexicans have accepted the verdict of 1848. By accepting that they have been defeated by Zionism and trying to strike the best possible deal with the Israelis, they hope they can get along with their lives. By contrast, most Israeli Jews who support partitionism tend to view the idea as good because it affords both Israelis and Palestinians, in their view, self-determination. The notion of self-determination is one that most people like in the abstract. You ask, are people for self-determination for X? Yes. But which, like free speech or academic freedom, causes enormous headaches when examined closely. I do not propose to examine the notion of self-determination philosophically at all. I will leave it to others like Raja the question of whether there are collective rights, like a right of national self-determination, and whether both Jews and Palestinians, or only the latter, or neither, have such rights. I will even leave aside the question of whether the notion of human rights, divorced from historical and social context, makes any sense. What sense is there, if any, for example, in saying that feudal lords in the High Middle Ages violated the human rights of serfs? Rather, it is certain social struggles that themselves give rise to the possibility of a discourse in which serfdom can be criticized as a denial of the serf's rights. So this was described, for example, as a discussion between realism and idealism. But in a certain way, I thought, in a different sense of meaning realism, one could say it's a discussion perhaps between realism and nominalism. For me, to criticize states on moral grounds therefore strikes me as an exercise in futility. It is rather like criticizing the immorality of carnivorous animals for eating other animals. States are in general means of domination and collective violence. This domination and collective violence is sometimes disguised, but it is always present. And the most successful states are the ones that usually, at least to their own population, disguise this domination. This domination is first of all class domination, but also necessarily directed at other states. That this is true is something more or less self-evident if one speaks about distant history. We're talking about the Caliphate of Harun al-Rashid or France under Louis XIV. Well, people would say, well, yes, that makes sense to talk about those types of states that way. But somehow it's imagined that in the 21st century we've got beyond all that. So our imagination of the world, or a certain imagination of the world, is rhetorically fed by documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which naturalize and treat as real, although in most of the world they're fiction, a notion of the world which originated as part of the social transformation of parts of Europe in the wake of the French Revolution, and which is then spread to the rest of the world. Perhaps nothing, therefore, testifies more to the wonderful bourgeoisification of the world than the near universality of lip service paid to human rights, democracy, and the nation state often under the category of sovereignty or national self-determination. Now, in its criticism of the naturalization of ethnic antagonism between Arabs and Jews, which is the assumption of the partitionist approach, so in the anti-partitionist approach criticism of that, I'm sympathetic to the non-partitionist transformationist approach. I don't think that one should take ethnic antagonism or national antagonism for granted. The problem I have is that almost inevitably this approach seems to me to end up as a mystification of the liberal state. And there is, I think, a historical trajectory here, so that anti-partitionist arguments are now formulated almost exclusively in purely liberal terms, whereas in the past they would have been formulated potentially in more radical terms. Two examples will have to suffice of how anti-partitionist discourse about the state, I think, idealizes a liberal state. One is South Africa under apartheid and France, which are both used as common examples. So in activist circles, Zionism is frequently compared to apartheid, and the dismantling of apartheid held up as a model for pro-Palestinian activists to follow now that the Arab nationalist enthusiasms of former years seem to have hopelessly run aground. There are, however, two problems with this example. The first is that the sociological bases of apartheid in South Africa and Zionism in Israel differ radically, which necessarily affects the possibility of a certain types of struggle. People will talk, for example, about Bantustans in the West Bank. Now, having been to the West Bank, this analogy seems to me quite wrong. I mean, the correct analogy for what happens in the West Bank is not a Bantustan, it's a prison system. A Bantustan is a manifestation of a particular type of capitalist economic rationality. A prison system is not. The purpose of occupying the West Bank has nothing to do with extraction of surplus labor for the Israeli economy. And the other problem is that in what actually happened in South Africa is that in South Africa, apartheid could be dismantled because the nature of capitalist domination could survive apartheid. In other words, one could dismantle apartheid and capital and the basic structure of society economically could be maintained even with one man, one vote. Similar things happened in the 19th century in Europe with the advent of universal suffrage. The other example is France, which is, on the contrary, held up not as something similar to what Israel, but rather as a state of all its citizens. Thus, the French example is held to deny as a response to the Zionist claim that the Jewish state for Jews is as natural as a French state for the French. But here, too, a question is big. The fact that certain claims are not legally formalized, that a state doesn't officially proclaim itself an ethnic state, does not make it any less an ethnic state. I think that the distinction often that you find in literature between ethno-nationalism and nationalism in general is a bogus distinction. Thus, the formal equality of all French citizens does not prevent the existence of Breton, Corsican nationalist movements, nor does it deny the reality of discrimination and prejudice against those French citizens who happen to be black, Arab, or Jewish. And this is not even getting into the question of how the French state actually happened to become a French state, or even a national state. Because well into the 19th century, most French people did not speak French. And in this respect, it's important to point out that the Zionist movement was not a response to formal legal Jewish inequality, but rather, on the contrary, formal equality and informal inequality. It is actually after Jews acquired full legal equality, albeit with the major exception of Tsarist Russia, getting into that's not as much of an exception as it sounds, that they began to experience the rise of racial anti-Semitism. And it's from the disillusionment with the promises of liberalism that Zionism arose. From the 1790s to the 1860s, the struggle of the Jews for what is somewhat misleadingly called emancipation took a classical liberal form. But from the 1870s, when the struggle for formal legal equality had been won in Western and Central Europe, to the 1940s, when catastrophe struck, Jewish political struggles took on a quite different character. Zionism is one strand of that, but other strands existed that also went beyond the goal of integration into the liberal nation state, notably in the vastly disproportionate number of Jews attracted to the socialist and communist movement. And you find that the further east you go, in other words, the further you are from the potential of a liberal politics making any sense, that not only is liberalism weaker, but both Zionism and socialism and communism, which stand as contrast to the liberal goal. Anyway, I don't have time to discuss the whole question of trajectory of Jewish history in the 19th century. But I want to go to this question of the role of the left, because I think it's a key point. The present contours of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are marked by three historical catastrophes, all of which are in living memory, all of which have continuing demographic and spiritual consequences. The first is the genocide of about two-thirds of European Jews in 1941 to 1945, called the Holocaust in English, Shoah in Hebrew, Korban in Yiddish. The second is the expulsion of Palestinians from 1947 to 1949, known as the Nakba. The third one does not have a name and is much less prominent, even among its victims and their descendants. And that's the expulsion of the large number of Jews, or the forced exodus, in Arab countries to Israel. The significance of the first two is generally acknowledged. But the point I want to make about the third point is that what's interesting about the last one is that it actually represents a kind of collusion between Arab nationalism and Zionism. Because if the Jews living in Arab countries were treated as a Zionist fifth column and driven out by Arab nationalists, ironically, nothing could more have pleased the Zionists. And it was particularly this forced exodus of Arab Jews that did two things. One, it demographically strengthened the state of Israel in a crucial way. And it also, politically, makes it vastly harder to argue for the possibility of Jews living in peace in the Arab world. Because remember, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were huge Jewish populations in places like Baghdad and Cairo and all of these places, which lasted into the mid-20th century. But I think that I think we're probably running out of time. But the point I want to make is the framing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, by postulating a purely liberal approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you run hard up against the contours of the present world system, and it's structured in nation states. So the only way I think that a one-state solution could acquire a realistic character is if it were combined with a much more radical view of transforming the world. Again, when you say this, of course, the question is, well, what are you talking about? Are you saying that the only way you can solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is world socialist revolution? And there are a lot of people, groups that I even was affiliated with who would say, yes, that's the only way. But in a sense, the problem of nationalism is precisely that. It's a global problem and cannot, I think, be solved in purely the case of Israel-Palestine. But I've taken too much time, and I want to get the questions and responses. And we can answer questions.
Thanks, Richard. I'd like to give some time to Raja now to respond to Richard's comments, and you can get double the time that Ron
Well, can we just talk? You can just talk. We don't have to measure time.
This is the first time I hear Richard's presentation tonight, and it takes me a while to think about some things, so I'll just say a couple of things, that's all. Basically my response to Richard is that I would like to, Richard and I have had this conversation before, and it almost always ends up being him using a mostly historical approach, me using a mostly philosophical approach.
We're friends, by the way.
We're friends, yeah. We're not gonna beat each other up. I have problems with the way he often uses history to interject on philosophical points. He has problems with my use of pure philosophy to ride roughshod over history, even though I don't think myself as riding roughshod over history. So that's basically a framework. But just a couple of responses to Richard. I understand the point, of course, that sometimes a solution to a problem is a way of actually reconfiguring the problem to begin with. So what sometimes can seem to be two competing solutions to the same problem is actually not that case at all. However, I haven't been convinced by his presentation tonight that this is the case as far as the two-state versus the one-state solution. I do see them as basically two competing solutions, that was a Freudian slip, two competing solutions to the same problem, which is what are we to do with this bloody land between the river and the sea, basically. So I haven't been convinced. But I'll just stop here, Richard, if you want to jump in. So I'm not,
Someone who's actually a mutual friend of ours who isn't here, but would say, Joel Finkel.
Oh, Joel.
When you talked about a one-state, we live in a small world. One-state, two-state solution, he would say it's not up to us, who are neither Israelis nor Palestinians, to advocate a position for a one-state or two-state solution. Now, okay, Raj,
it's a bad argument.
It's a very bad argument. But one of the problems with that is, about 15 years ago, I'm not sure the exact date, there was a plebiscite held in what had formerly been Czechoslovakia to determine whether Czechoslovakia should be one state or two. And it didn't even make the front page in the New York Times. It was like back page news. And nobody really paid any attention to it because it didn't really matter to anybody. It didn't even seem to matter very much to the Czechs and Slovaks. Now, it might be that under a different political order, that maybe Israelis and Palestinians would vote on whether to live in one state or two. What the one-state versus two-state solution is really about is the question of Zionism. It's the question of how do you respond to Zionism. So the two-state solution says, look, we can't do anything about Zionism. The Jews, for whatever reasons in their history, are Zionists. We can't militarily defeat this state. We have to make some kind of agreement. So the two-state solution is based upon the assumption you have to come to some kind of agreement between Zionism and Arab nationalism. The one-state solution is about getting outside of the framework, certainly of Zionism, and the question of whether it's beyond the framework of Arab nationalism is a more complicated question. So it is a radically different vision of the problem. One is saying, well, you have these two competing nationalisms, and the other is saying the problem is Zionism. And I think that's what the emotional energy is about the reaction to the one-state solution. And so the question, therefore, is what kind of political movement can one imagine to implement it? Look, I think one of the things that strikes me about the one-state solution is there isn't a political movement for the one-state solution. Well, why is the one-state solution popular? Because of political despair. Norman Finkelstein, in a debate with Ali Abunimah, said something to the effect of, like, I don't understand why you're calling for a one-state solution. If a two-state solution is horrendously difficult, you're giving up on something that's horrendously difficult to ask for something that's impossible. Now, that's the logic of why people support a two-state solution. But a lot of people have concluded that a two-state solution is impossible, therefore you might as well ask for a one-state solution. Now, sometimes people are also believing that somehow if you ask for a one-state solution, you're going to put pressure on people to give you a two-state solution. So, I mean, again, Raja says, well, the two-state solution is not realistic. But again, what you're asking for in a two-state solution, a quote, a viable two-state solution, is vastly less because you're not asking for a radical reconfiguration of the nature of the Israeli state. You're not asking for something radical. And the obstacle to it is the present attitudes of the Israeli and American governments, which conceivably could change, or are much more likely to change, than persuading Israelis to become anti-Zionist.
It depends on who your target audience is. There is a sense also in which the one-state solution is not asking something very radical, because
it's not, and that's the problem with it.
Can I finish?
Okay.
There is a sense in which you're not asking for something very radical. Sorry.
Before Raja, you respond, can I just say, can we collect the questions? Can you pass them all the way to your left, and we'll collect the questions. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
There is a sense in which the one-state solution has some very obvious practical steps that people can take to implement. If, for example, the Palestinian leadership tomorrow, and there have been calls for this done before, it takes the Palestinian leadership some courage to do this. If they were to dismantle the PA and to basically declare a popular call for one man, one vote in the Holy Land, you would change overnight. You would change the political language in the region. And furthermore, the very language of liberalism that you are dumping on Richard, now I agree there are tensions between liberalism as a general theory and the notion of a nation state on the one hand, et cetera, but the very language of liberal that many one-staters employ to argue for their position is very common currency. And that's why a lot of people, criticize Israel as being a Jewish ethnic state, et cetera, but somehow people don't see the fact that as an American, for example, how can I support Israel blindly, not realizing that it's a form of vicious ethnicity or ethnic state, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, there's a sense in which the one-state solution is radical, but there are other senses in which it's not radical. There's a sense in which some of the language it uses is radical, but there's a sense in which it's not radical at all. And I'm still not convinced, by the way, that we have two very different solutions to two different problems. It seems to me you can talk about the one-state solution in terms of a response to Zionism, but you can also talk about the two-state solution as a response to Zionism. What to do with Zionism? One of them says we're just going to basically accept it as a fact. That's the two-state solution. The other one says we're not going to accept it as a fact. We want to revoke it, historically speaking. So I don't think, no matter how you couch it, there's still competing solutions to the same problem. I'm still not convinced that we have an incommensurability going on here, as you put it in your introduction.
Well, leaving aside the question of incommensurability, I mean, the question of the radicalism of the one-state solution, it's true that one-state solution, as normally presented, is not radical in a fundamental way. On the other hand, in another respect, it is radical. It's radical vis-a-vis Zionism. It's not radical vis-a-vis the social and political order. And that, I think, that contradiction between its radicalism in one respect and its non-radicalism in another respect is the Achilles heel of why the one-state solution, as it is generally formulated in most of the popular books that formulate a one-state solution, isn't going to work. Because on the one hand, and it's in one sense, I sound like I'm criticizing Roger from the right. In another sense, I'm criticizing from the left. That is, if you live in a world of ethnic states, if the ethnic state is in some ways normal, then the logic of wanting an ethnic state, I mean, why do people want national self-determination? I mean, it's not a natural phenomenon to want national self-determination. One can easily imagine a world that is differently structured where there would not be a need for people to want national self-determination. And yet, the one-state solution essentially says, well, we're going to focus on the problem of nationalism in one particular corner without addressing the question of the nation-state or the social form it's embedded. Almost all of the discussions about a one-state solution, for example, completely leave out a discussion of class as having anything to do with the nature of the state. So ethnicity is discussed, religion, secularism, but the assumption that class has anything to do with the nature of the state. And contrary to what Roger said about the tension between liberalism and nationalism, historically, liberalism and nationalism grew up together.
I'm speaking about a philosophical tension, not a historical tension.
No, I know that. But you see, this is exactly I think the problem of these discourses, that we are, I joked to Roger at dinner that, I had this vision when Haseeb said conversation of sort of the conversation between Groucho Marx and Chico Marx and one of the Marx brothers, and like non-communication. So it is, at a certain level, that.
All right, let's get to the questions.
Yeah, let's get to questions.
Well, let's start with kind of a simpler question. How is it possible to convince the Israelis to accept anything to do with Palestinian rights? After all, they have nothing to gain. So maybe, Raja, you spoke about that briefly in your presentation. Maybe you can
I think the question is a little bit ill-formed, to be honest. I think a lot of Israelis are convinced of a lot of Palestinian rights. So the question really should be, how are you going to convince Israelis for a one-state solution, not Palestinian rights? I think a lot of Israelis, in a very political, theoretical sense, accept the fact that there should be a Palestinian state, and so they accept some sort of rights of self-determination for the Palestinians. So that's not really the issue. The issue is how you're going to convince them. As you can tell, I'm buying time before I answer the really difficult question, which is how you're going to convince them of a one-state solution. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I really don't know. But I think, the usual forms of political activism, where you're going to have to target, target the liberal streak in most Israelis. Now, of course, you have right-wing Israelis. That's obviously going to be an obstacle. But there are, you engaged in the usual international type of activism, the grassroots type of activism, where you have to approach Israelis on multiple levels, face-to-face levels, political fora levels, et cetera, et cetera. But I really don't have my approach to this whole question is really from moral, general, philosophical perspective, not as step one, step two to the one-state solution. But in a sense also, I would like to add that you have to keep in mind that such questions would be very difficult for any such similar solutions in the past towards other similar conflicts. In other words, when you face a very difficult type of political situation that seems to be insoluble in many ways, similar questions can be raised, and somebody can say, well, how are you going to convince this party that this is going to happen? And then people throw out their arms up in the air and say, oh, well, that's impossible. You can't envision it. And then they happen, So the fact that I don't have actual political steps that I can implement to convince the Israelis, and you have to keep in mind, when you talk about how you're going to convince someone, it's a very tricky question, because for instance, I could be living with someone whom I know quite well, and you ask me a question, how are you going to convince him to do so and so? And I might actually be able to outline certain steps, but there are no guarantees that I will succeed, because when it comes to convincing people of certain things, we have a very open, unclear terrain ahead of us.
I'll respond quite briefly. I agree with first part of Roger's answer. I think also the issue is not convincing Israelis in the abstract of any Palestinian rights. I think the question is, particularly the question of a one-state solution, is the one-state solution seems from the Israeli standpoint to require Israelis to give up the right to self-determination. That's the real psychological obstacle. Also, on the question of what kind of political organizing, I would offer a different answer, and again, which is one of the things that struck me about the politics in Israel is that people who are quite left-wing and dovish, meaning like a Yossi Beilin, for example, head of Meretz, a left Zionist party, actually advocate very free market economic policy. And there's often a disjuncture between where people stand vis-a-vis peace and Arabs, the Palestinians, and domestic economic policies. And certainly over the last 10 years, there's been a huge growing class gap within the Israeli Jewish population. And I think that the only basis for organizing, or not the only basis, I won't say that because there are a lot of bases. I think that one of the things that is sorely lacking is a politics based upon class. I think that if you're really going to talk about a one-state solution, that the basis of that would first of all be a binational political movement. You can't have a one-state solution without a binational movement. So you'll have Israelis convincing Israelis, not Palestinians convincing Israelis. And part of that logic would have to be the logic of Israeli society. I mean, contrary to, it's not as though the majority of Israelis actually benefit, for example, economically from the occupation. It's not really as though being prison guard for a gigantic prison is necessarily a good or desirable thing. Now, like a lot of people, like people in the United States who don't benefit from American imperialism, that's not obvious to most Israelis. And in fact, Israeli politics have been going to the right over the last few years. But that's the answer I give.
Can I add just something very brief? It was triggered by something that Richard said. I think part of the problem is also, one thing that Ali says in his book that is really nice, I think, is that the Palestinian leadership has never really proposed to the Israelis a very convincing vision of what a one state should be. And I think so it's not so, it's part of the work to do in terms of convincing the Israelis to give up their Zionism and to share their land is to basically allay some worries and some fears that they have. For example, they're not giving up the right to self-determination. What they're giving up is the right to national self-determination in an exclusively Jewish state. They're not giving up the right to practice all sorts of, religious or whatever rights that they have in such a state. So in other words, part of the work has to be done in terms of allaying. And also another thing that has to be said also is that the other side of the question is some Palestinians also are going to need convincing to live on a one-state solution. They look at their brethren as they live now in Israel as third-rate citizens, and they say, why the hell should we do that? Actually, a good friend of mine he keeps saying, I'm a one-stater except for one problem, which will be Jewish racism against the Palestinians. That's why I'm against the one-state solution. But anyway, that's it.
Next question is, can one state exist that such Palestinians have the right to return and Jews everywhere retain perpetual possibility of citizenship? Can one state exist such that Palestinians have the right to return and Jews everywhere retain perpetual possibilities of citizenship?
Can such a situation exist?
Yeah, where I think it's where both Palestinians have the right to return and also.
I mean, yeah, in principle, I don't see why not.
Well, yeah, I mean, people have proposed that. I mean, again, I don't think that is actually really addresses the main Israeli concerns. I mean, I think that involves a misunderstanding of the psychology of Zionism, but that's another issue with most Jews. And you could argue against it in principle about if you really had, what that would mean.
So we have 2 more questions. I think this one, maybe Richard, you might want to answer first. But what are some reasons why Marxists historically call for a socialist federation of the Middle East in terms of Israel and Palestine?
Well, when you say Marxist historically, you're speaking really about a certain type of Marxist because, for example, the international communist movement from 1947 on, I mean, the communists, meaning the Stalinists, did not call for that. They called for a two-state solution. And both the Israeli Communist Party and the Palestinian Communist Party consistently called for a two-state solution. Those people called for that. I mean, the idea of a socialist federation of the Near East, a socialist federation of the Balkans, I mean, this is a general notion that has been widely held in sort of as a kind of Marxist slogan. And of course it's a good idea. I'm not sure particularly what sort of purchase it has. It's an attempt to get beyond the politics of nationalism. And somehow the idea is that if you have a broader federation, that you have economic integration. I mean, the question of federation is also interesting because Marxists historically have actually had a bias against federalism, which is a peculiar thing. But these are details of Marxology that are really not relevant to the question of whether a one-state solution is possible. By the way, I mean, I don't know if there are any Maoists here, but the Maoists are particularly dishonest, by the way, in their historical trajectory. Mao Zedong wanted to recognize the state of Israel, and Ben-Gurion did not because he was trying to please the U.S. And Mao's position on the state of Israel was exactly the same as Stalin's.
No, I'm fine. I'll leave Marxology to Richard.
Okay. Well, this one is directed at you, Raja. What is the value of the state beyond Israel-Palestine?
The state in general?
Yeah, I think the notion of the state.
I think that...
To cultivate virtue.
Let me handle this. I think states don't have any intrinsic values. They just have instrumental values if they do, which is basically to protect and provide for their citizens. Now, is it better to have some sort of world federation or a stateless world? From a moral perspective, I suppose yes. Yeah, does that answer the question? I'm not being glib, to use Tom Cruise's favorite word. I'm just, I really, that's all I have to say to the question. I mean.
Well, I mean, I would say historically the purpose of states is class domination. And I think that's still essentially the purpose of states. And the other aspects, like providing for citizens, et cetera, are incidental things that have happened despite the other fundamental social purpose.
Okay. At this time, I guess we only have one other question left, so if anybody has any additional questions, please just
people can just
raise
raise
it.
their
Yeah,
hand.
people.
Yeah, maybe
we don't have to like.
Yeah. Let's do that. Let's just go
There's
straight
the hand
to.
over there. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Kesh. How? Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, it's not a critique that matters. It's the basis of the kind of politics you build on the critique. So, the question is, like, if you had a broad radical movement in the Middle East, in many of these different places, the Middle East would look like a different thing, I would say. Now, you don't have that. In fact, the Middle East is probably the place on the planet where the situation of the left is most horrible. That's not an inherent aspect of the Middle East. Now, by the way, I would say Israel-Palestine is, from the standpoint of the left, the best aspect of the Middle East. It's the part of the Middle East where the left has the best prospect.
it's the least dismal, which is really saying, things are not looking good. But, it's just a world problem. It's not just about the Middle East or Israel-Palestine. Ultimately, I would argue that the nation-state form and capitalism will destroy humanity. So the question is, well, how do you get out of a trajectory which will destroy humanity? The probable trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that things will get worse, that in a generation or two you'll have a regional nuclear war. You won't have either a one-state or two-state solution. You can always look on...
No state solution.
Yeah, that's one solution, Everybody is irradiated.
Everybody's one?
Everybody's irradiated.
Oh, radiant.
The question is, you said it about Zionism being, this is a very important thing that one has to deal with. They want to deal with one solution. But and then we also gave the example, the criticize of the Czechs and the Slovaks, that they came and they separated but and the Belgians are now talking about the separation between North and South and Belgium. But all these things, all these happenings, all these whether we talk about these solutions, that why should the situation as it stands right now, whether coming from the point of view of the Israelis as a nation state and the Palestinians and also the rest of the world, but I don't see the rest of the world being that the Palestinian question is really it's not necessarily big enough problem that one has to solve immediately or at any time soon because of it seems to me that what is the situation as it's going on, especially through the eyes of the interest, really interested, but it's that everybody is actually content with that. Even you see the Arab states are almost content with what's going on. And this one-state solution is sort of like a very far-fetched, even though it might be the best solution, it's just so far-fetched. And not only so far-fetched, but it's not necessary for anybody involved at this time. It just seems not necessary. It seems there is nobody there that is, sitting and saying, oh my God, we have to have a solution to this problem, and this is the best solution we have to have. There is no, it just doesn't seem.
Are you asking me or Richard?
Both.
Can I start?
Sure.
And then you can. I actually disagree with you about your characterization that nobody thinks that that the solution is pressing for the region. I think you're mischaracterizing what's going on. Specifically, I think the Arab governments have been feeling the heat now very seriously in many ways, and they are feeling the pressure that something needs to be done about the region. Now, I agree with you that nobody's thinking that the one-state solution is that's how we should deal with it. So your question is, there are two parts to your question. One which I think is mistaken, and the other with which I agree. So I think you're wrong to think that nobody thinks. I think people realize that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has generated a lot of political heat around the world and has generated a lot of different movements that are sort of one way or the other directly causally related to it. And that has put pressure on a lot of governments around the world to have to do something about it, especially in the Arab world. I do agree with you that nobody thinks that the one-state solution is what we should be discussing. I mean, the solution on the table is the two-state solution, and nothing in my presentation that I say denies this, of course. But I could repeat the same point that I made before, is that I don't think a viable two-state solution is. I mean, people pay lip service to it. They say, yeah, that's how things should go. But I don't see anybody actually really doing anything to bring it about.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say is that, yes, the one-state solution is,
The morally best.
yes,
Yeah, I
but there is no practical reasons for that solution. Meaning, as it goes, if it continues what it's continuing right now, with the three-state solution, which is continuing right now, and with most states, except
See, this is the part.
essential for a one-state solution at this time.
See,
It's just-
but this is what I'm trying to tell you is your question is really two parts. When you say this can continue forever, what does this mean? The status quo?
Yeah.
Well, okay, fine. You might be right that the status quo can go on forever, but and you might be right that it can go on forever and ever, and nobody's going to think let's do a one state. People can continue to think let's do a two state. I agree with that. There's no problem, but the fact that it can go on forever doesn't mean, I mean, it's an ambiguous claim that you're making. And does that mean that it can go on forever and people just don't care, let it go on forever? That, I think you're mistaken. I think people really care. They do want to solve it one way or the other. So, but now they might be incapable of solving it. So in that sense, we might have a fuse that just keeps lighting on and on and on and on. That's true, But you basically need to disambiguate your question a little bit. I mean, when you say go on forever, does that mean despite what people want, or does that mean that because people just are indifferent? I think the latter is mistaken.
With the question, I think most governments in the world would like the problem solved, most of the Arab governments. I don't know how much pressure they feel.
I have a lot
But-
of pressure.
Well, but in any case, whatever the amount of pressure that they feel to solve it or to seem to be solving it, there's really relatively little they can do because the cards are controlled by Israel and the United States. And that's true of most of the governments in the world. I don't think things can actually go on forever. I mean, things can maintain the present miserable condition and keep getting worse, but there is a level beyond which things will fall out of control, not so much because of the rest of the world, but because both Israeli and Palestinian societies are disintegrating under the effects of the conflict. And that has very serious consequences for both. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Belgium. I mean, I would say that the one-state solution conceived of in its liberal terms is an attempt to turn Israel-Palestine into Belgium. That's what one of the things I used to formulate it. And that's what I am skeptical of. The other point I wanted to make, and it's a specific point having to do with Zionism, is Zionism and Israel is a peculiar country. Israel is the only nation state where, in effect, its own nationality is legally denied. There was an attempt to have Israeli written on the citizenship cards of Israelis, and this has to do with the notion of it being a Jewish state. And there is a profound tension between the notion of Jewish national identity and Israeli national identity, which is itself a product of Zionism, and it's a very deep and complicated contradiction.
Perhaps one final question, and then
We can take a couple
We can take.
yeah, go ahead.
He was first, I think. But then go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Richard. The issue of religious identity is something that masks class issues on both the Jewish side and the Arab side. How would you address this issue, and how could a potential Richard Rubin approach and untangle this question of religious identity and, as I said, masking class consciousness or turning it into something else, erasing it?
Well, I don't think, I mean, there is the problem on both sides of religion and fundamentalist politics, but I don't think that fundamentally it's about religious identity. I think it's about national identity, so that the fundamental Palestinian identity is a secular one. In the Israeli case, it's more complicated because of the duality of Jewishness as an ethnic national identity and a religious one. But fundamentally, that too is a secular one. I mean, the people, incidentally, in Israel who are the most religious Jews are also the people who are, of the whole Jewish population, the least Zionist, which is a paradox. Not necessarily that they're allies of the Palestinians, but they're people who have the least identification with the Zionist state.
Yes.
Yeah, I had, I guess, a couple of questions. One of them being, well, I guess, question of somebody said, Zionism is growing quickly, etc. And it does seem that Israel is really only existing for a small blip in historical sense, and it's propped up by so many complex forces across the world. It seems like a very fragile and delicate situation. It seems it will be bound to fail at some point through the inevitability of just forces on the outside, region, etc. So it doesn't seem like it will be perpetual. And I think a lot of, from from people I've spoken to, a lot of Palestinians come to understand the kind of staying power. They're not being propped up by any economic forces, yet they still have this kind of staying power effect, which I think is very intimidating to Israelis. It seems that it's not going to be perpetual. I mean, I think a lot of people also accept that. But the other question I have is about the Palestinians themselves. A lot of Palestinians I've spoken to, at least they recognize that asking for a one-state solution, one man, one vote would have a very powerful resonance. But yet why is, granted, a lot of people say Fatah is a puppet government, but why is there not, or we don't hear as much pressure on the Palestinian leadership to request that, I guess, or changing from the pre-1988 period to the post-1988 period. Okay, now they were talking about two-state, that hasn't worked. I think I don't really think it's the Palestinians themselves that are not really uncomfortable with the one-state solution, but perhaps the Palestinian leadership is being controlled by the outside, perhaps, and wanting to suppress that discussion and that kind of rhetoric, which I think would somewhere. How could anybody argue against it? How does the Palestinian leadership continue not pushing that agenda?
Do you want to go ahead?
I'll go, and then well, on the question of Israel's fragility, I think that Israel is fragile, and I think there is very much that sense among Israelis. The question is, what kind of implosion you're talking about, because Israel's implosion is not necessarily a victory for the Palestinians. It will implode on them. It's like bringing down a building and it collapses and destroys you with it. So the destruction of Israel could easily take with it the entire Middle East. The other question about the one state, the one man, one voteism, were you at the Michael Tarazi event? A while ago. I think you were there. And there was this gathering, a guy, Michael Tarazi, at the time was working for the PA, or for the PLO. And PLO, not PA, very important difference. And he was putting forward the idea that Palestinians should say, look, we can't get a two-state solution, let's call the Israeli bluff and just surrender and say, give us Israeli citizenship. And which is actually not a bad idea, although it's actually a very difficult idea to implement in practice. It would certainly be much better than lobbing stray grenades, stray rockets at Sderot or something like that, or blowing up suicide bombs, this kind of nonviolent movement demanding Israeli citizenship. But when he said this, what struck me was the intensely hostile reaction he got from most of the Palestinians in the room. And one person I spoke to was this guy Mahmoud, I can't remember his last name, and I said, Mahmoud, why are you so hostile this day? I thought you were for a one-state solution. And he said, well, yes, I'm for a one-state solution, but not that one-state solution. And he saw it as a PLO trick. Now, I'm not quite sure of the psychology of that, but somehow saying, well, let's try to get Israeli citizenship, again, triggers off an emotional reaction. And practically, it's questionable that it could be implemented, because there are a lot of ways that even if you could build a disciplined enough nonviolent movement, at most what it would probably result in is a two-state solution, which is really, I think, why Michael Tarazi was advocating. And the other problem you have is that a group like Hamas doesn't want that as a strategy either.
Yeah, I think just to add, I don't have much to add to what Richard was saying, but I think the event that Richard was referring to with Michael Tarazi, it was more of a tactical move to put pressure on Israel, and it's been done before a couple of times to get, to scare the Israeli leadership. Oh shit, now they want a one state, we better give them a decent state of their own, basically. But I think also the Palestinian leadership has had some issues. They're basically everyday type of power stuff. Well, first of all, a lot of the Palestinian leadership doesn't think that the one man, one vote thing is going to work. It's not going to fly, so they don't pursue it seriously in earnest. And many of them many of the leaders worry that if such a state were to come about, they're going to lose their grip on power. They want to maintain their power, and many of them see themselves as being the leaders of any full-fledged future Palestinian state. And so it's just basic human psychology and grab for power. And I agree with Richard also, Israel is a very fragile state, and how it implodes is very important if it does implode. But whether it takes out the whole Middle East, it depends on how it's destroyed. Yeah. So, just being a little bit
the lines of my argument. I don't think I was making a specific argument. I mean, I'm speaking about, in terms of speaking about a hypothetical movement for binational socialist one state, well, then if that movement existed, it would be easy to know what kind of solidarity it would want. I mean, right now we're in the main political issue right now in the United States is the question of U.S. aid to Israel, direct aid. And most people involved in kind of Palestinian solidarity work have actually given up on that issue. There was actually, this shows how weak the movement is. There was a demonstration scheduled for June 10th, 2007, which is 40th anniversary of the end of the Six-Day War. And I made great effort to attend what was billed as this massive demonstration. And it was tiny. The organizers claimed 5,000 people. I thought there were more than 500. I said that on an email exchange. Someone said, oh no, there were almost 2,000. Now, you're talking about what are tiny numbers for a national demonstration. So unless you could even get much bigger numbers, you can't even talk about influencing Congress or any, we're not even talking about radical measures. We're talking about just the question of USA, which subsidizes the occupation. But that's all within the framework of two-state politics. I'm not talking about anything else.
I just have a question about the practical politics may be necessary for a one-state solution. And just in terms of, I don't know if this is a political category at all, but in terms of humiliation and I guess historical wrongs, memory, humiliation in the population. And I ask it because I feel that when I look at post-apartheid South Africa and many other places, you might find a liberal democratic solution, you might find a solution that is broker, but people still maintain this emotional type of memory and they still want to settle scores within the new nation. And I wonder if there was a practical possibility of a one-state solution. Do you believe maybe political actors would act differently if they knew if I have to be neighbors in a nation with a group of people, would I treat them differently if I knew that my humiliation today gives me a certain kind of payback tomorrow?
Well, yeah, of course. People will act differently with this kind of knowledge as opposed to not having this kind of knowledge, of course. But I know to many people this sounds like a cop-up, but I always distinguish between two sets of questions when it comes to the one-state solution, especially, but maybe also with the two-state solution, which is first you have the general philosophical question of what it means to have a single state. You can even go into some political theory in terms of setting up the institutions of the state, what they should look like, with paying enough attention to the history of the conflict, perhaps, without perhaps denying that there are two major ethnic groups in the state, et cetera, et cetera. But then you have the other aspect of it, which goes into more detail about what sort of constitution the state should have, whether it should have a truth and reconciliation committee like South Africa had, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to think about certain measures that you have to institute in place to perhaps monitor, police, whatever your favorite term is, the kind of reactions and actions that you have exactly in mind. So yeah, these things, if a one-state solution ever were to come into existence or on its way to being realized, et cetera, all these things have to be taken into account. And I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think that's
Funny?
yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
That's the clap for ourselves. We're not supposed to clap for ourselves.
So thank you very much, Raja and Richard, for coming, and it's a great talk. I'd also like to thank Around the Coyote for the generous support of this event, and also and also Platypus. I also wanted to announce that we're having a couple of other events that correspond to this show. So March 22nd, we have a talk on the relationship of art and political resistance in the case of Palestine. April 12th, we have a screening curated by the Chicago Palestinian Film Festival. And On May 3rd, we're going to have another panel discussion specifically on self-determination in Palestine, nationalism in Palestine. So, which will feature Atiya Khan and Thomas Capitan. So I hope to see you guys at some of these events as well, and enjoy the rest of the show. Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.